Okay, I think now it should be a bit better. Let me just make sure that video isn't archived at least, because it would be kind of awkward to have just a 10-minute video as a VOD. Okay, let's just get rid of that right now. There we go. Okay, so yeah. For those who don't know, chat, I'm actually a big fan of high fantasy. Anything tangentially related to things like D&D, or even things like Call of Cthulhu, and other tabletop games like Pathfinder as well. And I'm also a very big fan of coffee, as you can kind of tell, probably, I should hope. But yeah, so I figured what better book to try replacing The Ocean at the End of the Lane with than with one that manages to combine both. So yeah, without further ado, I suppose we can get started then, shall we? So once again, this is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I believe audio should be okay now as well. Right. Viv buried her great sword in the Scalvert's skull with a meaty crunch. Black blood thrummed in her hands, and her muscular arms strained as she tore it back and out in a spray of gore. It is very D&D. The Scalvert Queen gave a long, vibrating moan, then thundered to the stone in a heap. With a sigh, Viv slumped to her knees. The persistent twinge in her lower back flared up, and she dug in the knuckles of one huge hand to chase it away. Wiping sweat and blood from her face, she stared down at the dead queen. Cheers and shouts echoed from behind her. She leaned closer. Yes, there it was, right above the nasal cavity. The beast's head was twice as wide as she was, all improbable teeth and uncountable eyes, with a huge underslung jaw, and in the middle the fleshy seam she'd read about. Jamming her fingers into the fold, she pried it open. A sickly golden light spilled out. Viv slid her whole hand into the pocket of flesh, curled her fist around a faceted organic lump, and yanked. It came free with a fibrous ripping sound. Venice moved to stand behind her. She could smell his perfume. "Is that it, then?" he asked, only a little interested. "Yup," Viv groaned as she hoisted herself to her feet, using black blood as a crutch. Without bothering to clean the stone, she stuffed it into a pouch on her bandolier, then propped the great sword on her shoulder. "And that's all you want, truly?" Venice squinted up at her. His long, beautiful face was amused. He gestured at the walls of the cavern where the Scalvert Queen had entombed untold wealth within sheets of hardened saliva. Wagons, chests, and the bones of horses and men hung suspended amidst gold, silver, and gemstones, the shiny castaways of centuries. "Yep," she said again. "We're square." The rest of the party approached. Rune, Tyvus, and little Galena brought with them the exhausted but exultant chatter of the victorious. Rune combed muck from his beard. Galena sheathed her daggers, and Tyvus glided behind them both, tall and watchful. They were a good crew. They turned away and strode toward the cavern's entrance, where dim light still filtered through. "Where are you going?" hollered Room, his rough, affable voice. "Out. But aren't you gonna?" began Galena. Someone shushed her, most likely Fennis. Viv felt a prick of shame. She liked Galena the most and probably should have taken the time to explain. But she was done. Why drag things out? She didn't really want to talk about it, and if she said anything more, she might change her mind. After 22 years of adventuring, Viv had reached her limit of blood and mud and bullshit. An orc's life was strength and violence and a sudden sharp end, but she'd be damned if she'd let hers finish that way. It was time for something new. Chapter 1. Viv stood in the morning chill, looking down into the broad valley below. The city of Thune bristled up from a bed of fog that hazed the banks of the river, bisecting it. Here and there, a copper-clad steeple flashed in the sun. She had broken camp in the pre-dawn dark, and her long legs had eaten up the final few miles. Black blood weighed heavy on her back, the scalwart stone tucked in one of her inner jacket pockets. She could feel it like a hard, withered apple, and reflexively touched it through the cloth from time to time to reassure herself it was still there. A leather satchel hung over one shoulder, stuffed mostly with notes and plans, a few chunks of hardtack, a purse of platinum chits and assorted precious stones, and one small, curious device. She followed the road down and into the valley as the fog burned away. And a lonely farmer's cart tottered by, stuffed with alfalfa. Viv felt a rising sense of nervous elation, something she hadn't felt in years, like a battle cry she could barely hold in. She'd never prepared as much for any one moment. She'd read and questioned, researched and wrestled, and Thune had been the city she'd chosen. When she'd crossed every other location off of her list, she'd been absolutely positive. Suddenly, that conviction seemed foolish and impulsive, yet her excitement remained undimmed. No outer wall surrounded Thune. It had sprawled far beyond its original fortified boundaries, but she sensed herself approaching the edge of, well, something. It had been ages since she'd stayed in one place more than a handful of nights, the duration of a job. Now she was going to put down roots in the city she'd visited maybe 3 times in her entire life. She stopped and looked around warily, as though the road wasn't entirely vacant, the farmer long gone into the mist. Withdrawing a scrap of parchment from her satchel, she read the words she'd copied. Well nigh to Thonic line, the scalwart stone of fire draws the ring of fortune, aspect of heart's desire. Viv tucked it carefully away again, exchanging it for the device she'd purchased a week before from a Thomist scholar in Arvene. A witching rod. A small wooden spindle was wrapped in copper thread, which covered the runes inscribed along its length. A wishbone of ash was fitted over the top and into a groove so it spun freely. She held it in her fist, feeling the copper thread absorb the warmth of her palm. The spindle gave a barely perceptible tug. At last, at least, she was fairly certain it was a tug. During the Thaumists' demonstration, there had been a stronger pull. Viv pushed down the sudden thought that it had been all a parlor trick. As a rule, folks with a fixed address avoided swindling an orc twice their height, who could snap a wrist if they shook hands too firmly. She took a deep breath and strode into Thune, with a witching rod before her. Thune's wakeful noises rose as she moved further into the city. At the outskirts, the buildings had mostly been wooden, with some river stone foundations interspersed. The deeper she ventured, the more stone prevailed, as though the city had calcified as it aged. Muddy dirt gave way to smattering of stone lanes and cobbles near the city's core. Temples and taverns huddled around squares featuring statues of people who probably used to be important. Any doubts about the witching rod had evaporated. It definitely pulled now like a living thing, brief twitches growing into insistent tugs. Her research hadn't been in vain. Ley lines were clearly threaded beneath the city, powerful avenues of thaumic energy. Scholars debated whether they grew where people settled or gathered folk near them like warmth in winter. What mattered to Viv was that they were here. Finding a potent ley line was only the start, of course. The little wishbone of ashwood twitched left and right, tugging one way for a time before reversing and pulling like a fish on a hook in another direction. After a while, she didn't have to look at it. The feel of it was enough, and Viv paid more attention to the buildings as she passed. The device ushered her down the major thoroughfares, through the squiggling alleys that stitched them together, past blacksmiths and hostels and markets and inns. There were few people here her height on the streets, and she never found herself crowded. Black blood tended to have that effect. She passed through all the layers of smell that made up a city, baking bread and waking horses and wet stone and hot metal and floral perfume and old shit. The same smells you found in any city, but underneath them the morning scent of the river. Sometimes between the buildings she could see the blades of the water wheel at the flour mill. Viv let the rod lead her where it wanted. A few times the tug was so strong she stopped and inspected the buildings nearby. But disappointed, she'd continue onward. The rod would resist for a while until it seemed to give up, finding a new direction in which to surge. At last, when it yanked hard, she came to a semi-dazed stop and found what she needed. Not on the high street, that would have been too much to hope for, but it was the only one removed. Kerosene street lamps dotted the length, extinguished now, and like as not, you wouldn't be knifed there after dark. The buildings on Redstone showed their age, but the roofs seemed in good repair. All except one in particular, and here the witching rod drew her closer. It was small for what it was. A battered sign hung from the single remaining iron eye hook. Parkin's Library. Cozy stream. Thank you. It's a lot cozier than the ocean at the end of the lane, I'll give it that. The paint of the embossed letters long since flaked away. There were two large iron-bound wooden doors, but they were ajar, and the crossbeam was leaning against the wall nearby. Another smaller, orc-sized door was amusingly padlocked to the left of it. Viv ducked her head in for a look. Light filtered from a hole in the roof above, and a handful of clay shingles lay shattered across the broad alleyway, leading between 6 horse stalls. A ladder of dubious sturdiness led to a loft, and to the left, a small office with a back room. The sour smell of mouldering hay came from the trough at the back. Dust swirled in beams of light as though it never settled. It was as perfect as she could hope for. She tucked the witching rod away. When she re-emerged into the growing traffic of the street, she spied a knobbly old woman sweeping the stoop across the way. Viv was pretty sure she'd been sweeping since her arrival, the threshold no doubt sparkling at this point, but she continued to attack it with determination, shooting Viv a surreptitious look every other second. Viv strode across the street. The old woman had the good grace to appear surprised, mustering something approaching a smile as she did. "Do you know who owns this place?" asked Viv, pointing back at the library. The woman was less than half her height and had to crane to make eye contact. Her eyes disappeared as she compressed her face into a considering tangle of wrinkles. "Library? Mm-hmm. Well," she dragged the word out thoughtfully, but Viv could tell there was nothing wrong with her memory. "That's old Ansem, if I recollect properly. Never had much of a head for business, that man. Not for trade nor husband's work neither. To hear his old lady tell it." Viv didn't miss the woman's suggested pump of the eyebrows. "Not parking? Nope. It was too cheap to change the sign when he bought it." Viv's smile was amused, her lower fangs prominent. "Any idea where I can find him?" "Couldn't say for certain, but I imagine attending to the only work he never failed at." She tipped her free hand, bringing an imaginary tankard to her lips. "If you really want to find him, I'd try the places on Rawbone Alley. At about 6 over. She gestured to the south. This time of morning. Oh, this business he's serious about. "Thanks, miss," said Viv. "Oh, miss, is it?" cackled the woman. "You can call me Laney. You planning to be my new neighbor?" She made a give-it-over motion. Viv, said Laney, nodding. "I guess we'll see. Depends on whether he's as bad a businessman as you say." The old woman was still laughing as Viv left for Rawbone Alley. "Okay, give me a few seconds, chat. I just need to make sure that my alerts are not actually blasting, because it would be really awkward if they were. So let me just fix that really quick. But yeah, so far this is a pretty cozy book. Seems to be a lot longer as well. Better pacing too compared to Ocean at the End of the Lane. Thankfully. suppose that book was a bit intense, to say the least. Oh, there we go. Okay, I think they are indeed muted. That's good. Okay, back to where we were. No matter what Lainey said, Viv didn't really expect to find the much maligned Ansem at this time of day. She figured she'd ask after him in an Eastville joint. With an open door, and once she knew his haunts, track him down after the day wore on. Turned out she only needed 3 stops before she found him in residence. The tavern keep looked her up and down after she asked, raising his eyebrows pointedly at Blackblood's hilt over her shoulder. No trouble from me, just business, she said evenly. She tried to look less imposing. Apparently, satisfied that she wasn't spoiling for a fight, he cocked a thumb at the corner and went back to swabbing the grime off the bar top into new and more interesting locations. As Viv approached the table, she got the overwhelming impression that she was entering a den of some elderly woodland beast. A badger, perhaps, not a dangerous sense, but the feeling of a place where he spent so much time that it had absorbed his smell and become essentially his. He even looked like a badger, a big, greasy black beard striped with white, tangled across his chest. As wide as he was tall, he occupied so much space between the wall and the table that when he inhaled deeply, the thing rocked up on its legs. "You handsome?" asked Viv. Handsome allowed that he was. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, and then sat anyway, leaning Blackblood against the back of the chair. Truth be told, she wasn't really accustomed to asking permission. Ansem stared at her over puffy lower lids, not hostile, but wary. A tankard sat before him, nearly empty. He caught the tavern keep's attention and gestured at it, and Ansem brightened considerably. "Much obliged," he muttered. "I hear you own the old library on Redstone. That true?" asked Viv. Ansem allowed that he did. "I'm looking to buy," she said, "and I have a feeling he might be looking to sell." Ansem seemed surprised, but only briefly. His gaze sharpened. And while he might not have head for business, Viv was pretty sure he had one for haggling. "Maybe," he rumbled, "but that's some prime real estate. Prime? I've had offers before, but most of them don't see past the place to really appreciate the value of the location. That is to say, they underbid." At this point, the tavern keep swapped his tankard for a fresh one, and Ansel visibly warmed to his subject. "Ah yes, so many embarrassing offers. I have to warn you, I know what that lot is worth, and I can't see myself selling to anyone but a serious businessman. Er, businesswoman," he amended. Viv flashed her toothy and amused grin, thinking of Lainey. "Well, handsome, there's all kinds of business." Very conscious of Blackblood leaning behind her, she thought of how easy her her old business would have made this negotiation. But I can say for sure that when I do business of any kind, I'm always serious. She reached for her satchel, removed the purse of platinum chits, and hefted it. Withdrawing just one, she held it between thumb and forefinger, inspecting it and letting it catch the light. Platinum was a currency hardly ever seen in a place like this, and she'd need to exchange it for lower denominations soon. But she'd wanted some on hand for just this sort of moment. Ansem's eyes widened. Oh, serious. Yes, serious indeed. He took a long pull of his beer to cover his surprise. Sly dog, thought Viv, trying not to smirk. As one serious business person to another, I don't want to waste your time. Viv leaned on an elbow and slid 8 platinum chits across the table. It's probably 80 gold sovereigns. I think that covers the value of this lot. I'm sure we can agree that building is a loss, and I think the odds of another businesswoman tracking you down to pay cash on the barrelhead is vanishing. She held his gaze. He still had the tankard to his mouth, but wasn't swallowing. Viv began to withdraw the chits, and he hurriedly reached out, pulling up short, before touching her much larger hand. She raised her eyebrows. I can see you've got a keen eye for value, Ansem blinked rapidly. I do. If you want to take a moment this morning to bring the deed and sign it over, I'll wait here. But I won't wait longer than noon. Turned out, the old badger was a lot nimbler than he looked. As Viv made her mark on the deed and pocketed the keys, Ansem scooped the platinum into his purse, looking relieved the deal was complete. So, I didn't figure you'd be interested in library work, he ventured. It was common knowledge that horses didn't like works much. I'm not. I'm opening up a coffee shop. Ansem looked nonplussed. But why would you buy a horse stable for that? Viv didn't answer for a moment, and then she stared hard at him. Things don't have to stay as what they started out as. She folded the deed and tucked it into her satchel. As she left, Ansem hollered after her. Oh, and hey, what in the 8 hells is coffee? You know, it's time like this that I kind of forget that coffee is not really a commonplace in most fantasy settings. Viv had 3 more stops to make before returning to the library. The exchange at the trade depot to put some copper, silver, and gold in her purse. And then she was off to the Athenaeum? Athenaeum. Athenaeum. Athenaeum is probably it. Not the small Thomic University on the north bank of the river. She'd wanted to know the location anyway, in case she needed to do any reading. More importantly, the territorial post ran between the scattered Athenaeums and libraries in most major cities, and it was dependable. Those copper-clad steeples she'd seen made it easy to locate. Seated at one of the big tables between the shelves, she wrote 2 letters using a few sheets of her parchment. The smell of paper and dust and time put her in mind of all the recent readings she'd done in places just like this. A lifetime of training her muscles and her reflexes and her hardness of mind, traded for reading and planning and amassing details. She smiled ruefully as she wrote. The gnome at the post counter couldn't stop goggling at her as she stamped the wax seal. The woman had to take the addresses twice. She was so flustered at seeing an orc in the building. I'm looking for a locksmith. Know of anyone reputable? The gnome's mouth hung open a moment longer, but she recovered herself, then flipped through a directory behind the counter. Mark Evans' Sons, she replied, 827 Mason's Lane. She gave some sketchy directions. Viv thanked her and left. Mark Evans' Sons was there as advertised. A silver and 3 coppers lighter, she left with an enormous and quite heavy, strong box under one muscular arm. Back at Parkin's library, as the sun set, Viv unlocked the office door, rebarred the stable doors, and hauled the strong box behind an L-shaped counter in the office. She stowed the deed and her funds inside, locked it, and strung the key around her neck. After some testing with her feet and fingertips, she found a loose flagstone in the main pathway between the stalls and, flexing mightily, levered it up and out. Excuse me. After some testing with her feet, she scooped earth from beneath and then carefully placed the scalbert stone in the hollow. Covering it with the dirt, she replaced the flagstone and took a stiff and shedding stable broom to the area to ensure it looked undisturbed. She stared down at it for a few moments, all her hopes centered on this small stone, buried like a secret heart in Parkin's library. No, not the library anymore. This place was Viv's. She looked around. Her place, not a temporary stop or a spot to sling her bedroll for one night. Hers. The brisk evening air swirled through the hole in the roof, so for tonight at least it would probably feel like any other night under the stars. Viv glanced up at the loft and the ladder leading to it. She tested one of the lower rungs with a foot, and it shattered like balsa. She snorted, unstrapped black blood, and with both hands tossed it into the loft, startling a bunch of pigeons that escaped through the roof. Gazing after it for a moment, she then unfurled her bedroll in one of the stalls. There'd certainly be no campfire, and there were no lanterns to speak of, but that was all right. In the dimming light, she surveyed the interior. Amidst horse apples of antiquity and the dust of neglect, she didn't know much about buildings, but it was clear that this one needed an unbelievable amount of work. But at the end of it, something she built up rather than cut down. It was ridiculous, of course, a coffee shop in a city where nobody even knew what coffee was. Until 6 months ago, she'd never heard of it, never smelled or tasted it. On the face of it, the whole endeavor was ludicrous. She smiled in the dark when at last she lay back on her bedroll. She started to list her task for the following day, but didn't make it past the third. She slept like the dead. Okay, this is a very cute and cozy book. I'm already liking it, chat. It's a really, really cute book. Alright. Excuse me, sorry, this is so cozy, it's making me sleepy. Chapter 2. Viv woke in the pre-dawn indigo to the growing murmur of the city outside. The pigeons cooed in the loft, where they'd returned to their nests. The ASMR is working then. Yeah, it seems like it is. She rose and checked on the flagstone above the scalvert stone. It's too cozy, even I'm feeling sleepy. Well, that's perfectly fine. Mod check. And feel free to sleep, chat. That is mainly the point of ASMR after all. To relax after a long day. So hopefully, if this is cozy enough for you to pass out to, then mission accomplished. If not, then at the very least you get to hear a very cute story about an orc making a coffee shop. Alright. She rose and checked on the flagstone above the scalvert stone, undisturbed, of course. Gathering a few things, she slipped into the street, chewing the last of her hardtack and inhaling the moist morning scent of the shadows giving way to the sun. She felt limber and coiled, like she was up on her toes, ready to break into a sprint. Across the street, Lainey had swapped her broom for a bowl of peas and sat on the three-legged stool, shelling them. They traded amiable nods. Amiable. And then Viv locked up and left in the direction of the river. She found herself humming as she walked. I'm going to do something dangerous and lean into my chair. Okay. In the receding morning fog, Viv made her way to the shipyards, clinging to the bank of the river. The place was alive with the clatter of hammer and saw, shouts muffled by the mist. What she wanted was fixed in her mind, but she didn't expect to find it right away. She could be patient, though. In her experience, you had to be. After long hours spent reconnoitering or staking out a beast's lair, Viv had made peace with the passage of time. She bought some apples from a ratkin urchin, hawking them from a burlap sack, found a stack of crates out of the way, and settled in to observe. The boats here weren't large, mostly keel boats and little fishing boats, best suited to the river. A dozen or so were up along the quay, attended by small knots of shipwrights, being scraped or tarred or repaired. She watched them as they worked, keeping an eye out for what she wanted. The cruise ebbed and swelled as the morning progressed. Viv was on her last apple when she found what she'd been looking for. Most of the crews worked in twos and threes, big men with big voices scrambling over the hulls and hollering to one another as they did. A few hours on, though, a man of smaller stature appeared, hauling a wooden box of tools, half as large as himself. His ears were long, body wiry, skin leathery and olive, with a flat cap pulled over his brow. You didn't see hobs often in cities. Humans despairingly called them pucks and shunned them, so they liked to keep to themselves. It could relate, but she was more difficult to intimidate. He labored alone at a small dinghy, while shipwrights and dock workers avoided like him. She watched his diligent, fastidious work. Viv was no woodworker, but she could appreciate craft. His tools were meticulously organized, sharp and well cared for. There was a deliberate economy to his every motion as he used the drawing knife and plane and other things that she didn't recognize to shape a new gunwale. She polished off her apple and watched him at his work, trying not to be too conspicuous about it. Working was a well-used part of her skill set, after all. It was known when he tightly replaced his tools and unwrapped a lunch from his toolbox, and Viv approached. He squinted up at her from under his cap, but said nothing as she loomed over him. "It's nice work," said Viv. At least I expect it is. I don't know if... I don't know much about boats, she admitted. "I expect that those a compliment to touch then," he replied, his voice dry and deeper than she'd expected. She laughed and looked up and down the quay. Not many here do that. Not many here that do the work alone. Nope. Whoops. Okay. "You get a lot of work?" He shrugged. "Enough. Enough so you wouldn't like to have a lot more." He removed his cap then, and his look was more speculative. "For someone who don't know much about boats, seems odd you're expecting to need much shipwriting." Viv dropped to her haunches, tired of towering over him. "Well, you're right, I don't. But wood's wood and craft's craft. I watched you work. Live long enough, you realize some folks can be handed a problem and some tools, and they'll sort it out. And I never think twice about hiring that sort of fellow." Although she reflected, the tools and fellows had been historically a lot larger and a lot bloodier. He began again. "I'm Viv." She held out a hand. "Calamity." His own calloused paw was swallowed by hers. Her eyes widened. "Hobname. You can call me Cal. Whichever you like best. I don't need your name to suit me. Cal's fine. The other's too much of a mouthful." He folded the linen back over his lunch, and she now felt that she had his full attention, So this work, did I hear the now sort of prospect, or he flapped his hand at some vaporous future? You're a now. Well paid, and with the supplies you ask for, not the ones I chose for you. She withdrew her purse, opened it, removed the gold sovereign, and extended it to him. Cal held out his hands as though to catch a toss, but she deliberately placed it in one palm. He pursed his lips and bounced it in his hand. So why me, exactly? He made the hand coin back to her, but she declined. Like I said, I watched you work. Sharp tools. You clean as you go, your mind's on your business. She looked around at the conspicuous absence of men nearby, and you do it even when some might say it's wiser not to. So you want me for my lack of wisdom, eh? It ain't boats you want built. What exactly have you got in mind? I think I have to show you. Okay, chat. I will be right back because I do need a coffee. Because I am actually about to fall asleep as well. So just give me a bit. which is good because I was about to pass out. Because dang, this is a really cozy book. Okay, where were we? Rack and ruin. Cal swore under his breath. He removed his cap and tucked it to the top of his breeches. They stood outside Parkin's library, the stable doors thrown wide, and Viv experienced a momentary twist of uneasiness. "Don't know much about roofing," he said as he peered up at the hole. "But you can figure it out?" He replied, and what Viv was coming to understand was an affirmative. He walked slowly around the interior, kicking at the stall panels, stomping on the flagstones. Viv tensed when he walked over the one above the Scalbert's stone. He peered back at her. "How many are you planning to hire? You have someone you like to work with? I'm not opposed. Other than that, I'm a ready pair of hands, and I don't tire easily." She held them up in demonstration. "It's not a library I'm wanting, though." "No? Ever hear of coffee?" He shook his head. "Well, I need a restaurant, I guess, for drinks." Oh, she went to her satchel and withdrew a set of sketches and notes. Suddenly, she was unaccountably nervous. Viv had never cared much for the judgment of others. It was pretty easy to ignore when you had 3 feet and 6 stone on most of the folks you encountered. Now, though, she was worried that the small man would think her a fool. Cal was waiting for her to continue. She found herself rambling. "I came across it in Azimuth, the gnomish city outside of the East Territory. Was there for a... well, it doesn't matter what I was there for, but I smelled it first, and I came across this shop, and they made... well, it's like tea, but not like tea. It smells like..." She stopped. "And it doesn't matter what it smells like, I can't describe it anyway. At any rate, imagine I'm opening a tavern, but with no taps, no kegs, no beer. Just tables, a counter, some room in the back. Here, I did some sketches of the place I saw." She thrust the papers at him and felt color rising in her cheeks. Ridiculous. He looked at the pages and examined them, paying careful attention to each, as though he were committing every line to memory. After several agonizing minutes, he returned them. "Those are your sketches. Not bad." If anything, she flushed hotter. And you're planning to stay here, too?" He cocked a thumb at the loft. "Seems that's suited. Yes." He put his hand on his hips and stared into the bay where the stalls stood. She'd half expected him to turn on his heel and leave, but now she was beginning to think she might have chosen just right. "So..." He walked around the space again. "Seems you could keep the stalls, cut them down some, tear out the doors, box it in along the walls for benches. Take some long planks, set them up on a trestle in between. Then you got yourself some booths and tables here along the sides. Tear down that wall into the office. The counter might do. Need to check for rot." He kicked at the splintered wood from the ladder and raised his eyebrows at her. "Gonna need a new ladder. Couple bags of nails, whitewash, paint, clay tile, some riverstone, bags of lime. Might want a few more windows in the place, and a lot of lumber. So you'll do it?" He gave her... "So you'll do it?" He gave her another one of his long, speculative looks. "What did you say?" "I do things when it seems wiser not to." "Well, if you're helping, I guess so. Give me some of that parchment and a stylus if you've got it. We're going to need a list. A long list. Tomorrow we can see about getting the orders filled and how much flatter we can make that purse of yours. For the first time since she'd met him, he offered a thin smile. Not gonna ask how much it'll cost? Do you even figure you know yet? Do you figure you even know yet, rather? Don't suppose I do. Well then, Viv dragged an old tack crate away from the wall, blew away the dust, and handed him a stylus. They bent over the parchment together as Cal started writing. Cal left in the late afternoon to complete his work on the dinghy, promising to return in the morning. Oh, that was loud, sorry. Viv tucked away the materials list and then stood in the hush of the library, where the low noise outside seemed hardly to intrude. She looked out the doors and across to Laney's porch, but found it empty. She suddenly felt very alone, which was odd. Viv had spent plenty of times with no company to speak of. Long treks, lonely campgrounds, cold tents, dripping caves. But in a city, she was almost never alone. One of her crew would have been with her. Now, in this city, filled with people of all races and backgrounds, the solitude was terrible. She knew 3 people by name. None of them were even more than an acquaintance, although Laney seemed friendly at least, and Cal was strangely calming to be around. She locked up and headed toward the main thoroughfare, pointedly away from Rawbone Alley. You feel you need company? Well, fine. Here we are. New place, new home, for good this time. Viv found the brightest, loudest establishment she could. A restaurant and pub that seemed to do good business with no staggering drunks in the street out front and no puddles of piss to step over. She ducked under the lintel and entered, and there was a momentary drop in the conversational volume. The theme was pretty cosmopolitan, and orcs weren't unknown, just a little unusual. The noise picked right back up. Sorry, don't mind that, just had to send a message. She took a deep breath and tried to relax her face into a non-threatening expression, something she'd been practicing. Not hauling a great sword around and wearing plain clothes hopefully added to that effect. There was a long, clean bar top, sparsely populated, and a mirror on the wall behind. Lanterns blazed through the dining area. It wasn't cold enough for a fire, but the room was still cheerfully lit. The tables were mostly occupied. Viv drew up a stool at the bar top, and she tried not to fidget. She felt awkward. So many people so close, and for the first time she wasn't just passing through. It suddenly seemed that any faux pas or stumble here might follow and shame her forever before she'd even properly settled down. Irrational though she thought it was. A mullen-faced man approached, red-cheeked, his ears just a touch pointed. Probably a little elf in him, though his girth hinted at a very human metabolism. "Eating, ma'am," he said, and slid a chalk slate menu in front of her. "Eating or drinking?" "Eating," she smiled, trying not to bare her lower fangs too much. His expression didn't change a whit. Rapping a knuckle on the slate, he said, "The park's good. I'll let you think on it," and breezed away. When he returned minutes later, she ordered the pork, and while she waited for her meal, she gazed around, musing. She hadn't dared to think this far ahead before, except in a very abstract way. But with Cal signed up, she allowed herself to dream on it a little. The cafe she'd visited in Azimuth had been the very definition of gnomish architecture. Precisely fitted wall tiles, geometric shapes, and pavers arranged in intricate interlocking patterns. The furniture had, of course, been gnomish in scale as well. She'd had to stand. She'd known her place would be different, but now she tried to make that real in her head. She looked at the decorations inside the pub. Here, an oil painting in an old gilt frame. There, a huge ceramic vase on the floor with fresh ferns to sweeten the air. A simple chandelier with 3 fat candles, clearly changed regularly with no sloppy wax threads. Viv began to imagine her own place, brighter, she thought, with that tall barn ceiling, sunlight coming in from high windows. She could see what Cal had meant about the booths as well, but maybe another long table down the middle with benches, a kind of community seating. Viv saw it with the big stable doors thrown wide, perhaps a few stables there in the entry to catch the breeze and the sun. The flagstones polished, clean, whitewashed walls. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her meal, the rich smell of it reaching her first. She discovered that she was ravenous. "Before you go," she said, "I wanted to ask, is this your place?" The half-elf blinked and then smiled a little wider than his regular professional pleasantness. "Sure is. 4 years now." "If you don't mind me asking, how'd you get started?" He leaned on the bar top. "Well, it's not a family business, if that's what you're asking. My first place sure wasn't here on High Street." He chuckled at that. "And was business slow at first, or did they all come at once?" She waved at the room. "Oh my, slow. Very slow. Fair to say, I lost more money than I could afford to. And then I lost some more. But these days, I lose just enough to get by." "You planning to open a pub around here?" "Can't say I'd advise it." He winked at her, clearly joking. "Not exactly, but maybe something like it." He seemed surprised, but recovered swiftly. "Well, best of luck to you, ma'am." He spoke behind his hand in a stage whisper. "I'll thank you not to take my customers, though, here." "Not much chance of that, I don't think." "Well, that's all right then. Eat up now, or it'll get cold." Viv quietly ate her meal and didn't speak to anyone else. Her mood was meditative as she left the pub. She found a candler shop still open, bought a lantern, and returned to the library. There she lay awake, staring into its flame. The visions of what might someday be were far from the cold and derelict place where she bedded down. Tomorrow, though, the real work would begin. Okay. This is such an unbelievably cozy book. Chapter 3. True to his word, Cal arrived with the dawn. Viv had placed the tack crate out front and was sitting and watching the shadows take shape in the morning sun, contemplating how excellently a mug of coffee would suit her. The hob hauled his box of tools and placed it inside the big doorway. "Morning," she said. "Hmm?" he said. But he nodded genially enough. He removed his copy of the materials list from a pocket and unfolded it. Lots to do. Some of this will have directly, some will take time. We've produced our purse. Our platinum and most of our sovereigns were in the lockbox, but she figured there were sufficient funds to cover what was needed. She tossed it to Cal. I think I can trust you to place the orders, if you're willing. Cal looked surprised. He set his teeth thoughtfully for a moment before saying, I reckon you'll not get the best prices if I'm the one dickering. Think it'll go better if it's me? Her smile was sardonic. Well, maybe it's a wash, and you want to trust me with all of this? Don't fret, I'll stroll away with it. He bounced the purse in his hand. She gave him a long look, and her expression didn't lapse. No, he said, as he took in the size and shape of her. No, I suppose you wouldn't. Nib sighed. I've lived a long time knowing I'm a threat walking. I'd rather that wasn't the shape of it for you. He nodded and tucked the purse away. I'll need some hours. Viv stood and stretched, knuckling the ache in her lower back. It is always stiff and cold. I need to rent a cart, something to haul the junk with, and some place to haul it. The mill for the cart, said Cal. Figured you can find it. As for the rest, there's a midden out west and off the main road. Cart tracks hook south. Cart track hooks south. Thanks. That'll be off them. Cal tipped his cap and ambled back down the street. He was right. The mill was indeed willing to rent her a cart, plus a pair of animals, for a full silver, which was certainly more than it was worth. The miller grinned smugly after she paid, no doubt imagining the trouble an orc would face hitching up a horse, but she gripped the traces in both hands, lifted, and easily got the cart moving by herself. The miller watched her roll it away, scratching the back of his bald head amusedly. Viv worked up a healthy sweat and loosened herself up on the trip back. Along the way she haggled with a stonemason who had 3 or 4 ladders at a job site. He parted with one for 10 coppers too many, and she tossed it in the back of the cart. Lainey was back on her porch, broom in hand, attacking what Viv had to imagine was the cleanest stoop in the entire territory. She gave her a neighborly nod and began the hard work of clearing out the old building. It quickly became apparent exactly how much junk had accrued in the place. Rotten lumber, horseshoe iron, a set of rusted and bent pitchforks, a baled stack of grain sacks, crumbling tack, an assortment of saddle blankets thick with mold, then plenty of awkward, cumbersome, and decrepit miscellany. The office had its own share of debris. Moth-eaten ledgers, shattered inkwells, and an inexplicable set of winter underclothes gone grey with dust. Viv snapped the broken ladder, threw it in the cart, set up the new one, and climbed to the loft. Thankfully, there was only a little old hay, a pigeon's nest, and a few scraps of this and that. Black blood lay there in the dust, already gathering some dust itself. She picked it up, hefted it in her hands for a second, and then leaned it carefully against the slanted ceiling. By noon, the cart was piled high. Filth covered Viv from head to toe, and the library's interior looked like a sandstorm had passed through, with little tombs and drifts of dirt, having resettled after the disturbance. She thought with amusement that she should hire Lainey to broom it out, but when she looked in that direction, the old woman was absent. There was, however, someone else shadowing her own doorway. Viv's back prickled with a sense she trusted implicitly. It was the reason she was still moving around and breathing, after all. "Help you with something?" she asked, dusting off her hands and thinking about black blood laying up in the loft, out of reach. He was dressed stylishly, with a ruffled shirt, a vest, and a broad-brimmed hat, but on closer inspection his clothing was worse for wear, sweat-stained and a little frayed. Its skin had the grey cast of one of the stone fae, and his features were sharp. "Oh, no help required," he replied. "We like to welcome budding entrepreneurs into the city when we can, and I'm powerfully curious about what new business you'll bring to the district." His voice was smooth, almost cultured. "Oh, so you're a city official," Viv smiled. And this time she didn't concern herself with how prominent her lower fangs were. She approached him so that their difference in stature was even more apparent. She was pretty sure she knew exactly what this man was, and until recently, she'd have had him by the throat and off the ground already. He didn't adjust his posture an iota, smiling back. "Not as such. I just consider it my civic duty to welcome new arrivals and to take an interest in their welfare." "I'll consider myself welcome then." "I didn't catch your name." "You didn't, but fair exchange is no robbery. Didn't catch yours either." "Indeed, I don't suppose you'd mind giving me a little preview of your new—" He looked around her at the cart and waved a gloved hand. "Venture?" "Trade secret." "Oh, well, I wouldn't want to pry." "I'm glad to hear that." Viv walked back, grabbed the traces, and lifted, her biceps bunching as she started hauling. It was significantly heavier than it had been that morning. Her lower back lit up in a bright knot of pain. She didn't slow as she approached the door, staring grimly past her visitor who, at the last second, had to depart the threshold less gracefully than he would have doubtless preferred. "We'll catch up later," he called after her, as she rumbled the cart down the cobbles to the west, her face set, breathing hard through her nose. Above, the clouds began to clot and thicken, threatening rain. Everyone else on the street made certain they were clear of the coming storm. "Oh, sorry, I seem so I missed this. Guess I'll do that later then." Alright. When Cal reappeared that afternoon, the sky was even darker. Viv was seated out front on the tack box. The cart returned. Her sleeves were rolled up, and sweat striped the grime on her arms. As the hob approached, Viv saw a bundle under his arm, and when he stopped, he flapped the corner of it at her. "Tarpaulin. Looks like rain. Best we keep the new lumber dry." He tossed her purse to her, and she tucked it away without bothering to examine it. Viv hauled out the ladder and gathered a few stones from an alley. They both climbed onto the roof and anchored the tarp with the stones over the hole, just as raindrops began to speckle the tile a dusty orange. When they were back down and inside, listening to the drops clatter lightly overhead, Cal said, "Well, maybe no deliveries today, unless the rain slacks off." He looked around the barren interior. "A good job of it, eh? Looks a fair bit bigger now." Viv smiled ruefully as she surveyed the place. The emptiness of it somehow made the work to come more daunting. "Think I'm a fool?" Cal shrugged. not in the habit of offering my less than positive thoughts to somebody like you. Somebody like me, she sighed. You mean, I mean someone who's paying. He gave her one of his thin smiles. Well, as the one paying, I don't see a reason for you to wait around here while... She was interrupted by the arrival of a cart with 3 small sturdy crates in the back. Well, that's promise for you, said Cal. Viv headed out into the rain. That's not the supplies. She called over her shoulder. Surely caught the smell of it. Signing for the delivery, Viv paid the driver and declined his help hauling the crates one by one into the library. Each was tidily assembled, with the sides and base cleverly fitted and only the top nailed in place. Gnomish stencils ran along the panels at neat right angles. Cal watched curiously as Viv gently set down the last one, and then indicated Cal's toolbox, giving him a questioning look. Have at it, he said. Lifting a pry bar, she levered up the lid, and there inside was a set of muslin sacks. The scent was even stronger now, and Viv shivered in anticipation. Untying one, she dug a hand into it and let the roasted brown beans sift through her fingers. She loved the quiet hiss they made as they fell back into the bag. You're right. Not much like tea. Emerging from her reverie, Viv glanced up at him. You can smell it though, can't you? Like roasted nuts and fruit? Cal squinted at her. Thought you said you drank it. Viv nibbled one experimentally, tasted the warm, bitter, dark flavor as it coated her tongue. She felt she needed to explain. They grind it into powder and then run hot water through it, but there's more to it than that. When the machine shows up, I'll show you. Gods, the smell of it, Cal. This is just a ghost of it. She sat back on the flagstones and rolled the bean between her thumb and forefinger. I told you I came across it in Azimuth, and I remember following the smell to the shop. They called it a cafe. People just sat around drinking it from these little ceramic cups, and I had to try it, and it was like drinking the feeling of being peaceful in your mind. Well, not to be up too much, then it's something else. A lot of folks allow you to feel peaceful after a beer. It's different. I don't know if I can tell you how it is. Well, alright then. His look was not unkind. In the interest of your new business, I guess I'll say I hope folks have the same experience you did. So do I. Sherritt tied the sack, took his mallet, and started nailing the crate lid back down. When she looked up again, Cal was emerging from the office area. He stopped in front of her and stared at the floor ruminatively for a moment, and she was content to wait for what he had to say. Figured you might need a sort of kitchen back there. Stove, maybe a water barrel and some copper pipe. Hooks for pots and pans. The water barrel's not a bad idea. I should have thought of that, since I'll need the water. But a kitchen, what do I need that for? Well, he said, looking apologetic. If you find nobody wants any of the beans and water, at least you can feed them. As the day drew down, the rain stopped, and the city smelled, if not clean, at least refreshed. It wasn't quite dusk, but Viv took her lantern and her notes out to the tap box, which had cemented its role as her porch bench. Before she could settle in to re-examine them, she spied Laney across the way, wrapped in a shawl and blowing on a mug of tea. Viv set the lantern on the box, tucked away her notes, and stepped over the drying puddles to join the woman on her porch. "Evening," she said. "It is." Laney nodded at the library. "Seems you've been mighty busy, miss." She grinned slyly when she said it. Oh. 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 Hi there. Hello, Raiders. Thank you for the raid. Hang on. Oh dear, I feel like my partner may have fallen asleep. Give me a second. Oh, thank God the command works. But yes, hello, hello. So yeah. Oh, that's a lot of people. Yes. Welcome to the Chip Cup Cafe. Thank you, Best Dad Tuber, for the raid. For those of you who are coming in, my name is Moka Kahvesi. I am the barista here at the Chip Cup Cafe, where you end up when you don't really know where you're going. Today we're actually reading, as you can see in the title, Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. Think of D&D, but instead of fighting dragons and monsters, you're basically just setting up a coffee shop. It's been a really comfy read so far. But yeah, how were you? How was your stream, Dad? Yes, I think I'll stick with Dad. How was your stream? I believe I saw you were doing ASMR earlier as well. Hopefully it was fun. Or at least enjoyable. Lots of bedtime stories tonight. Yeah, Dad's really good at reading bedtime stories. I would know every time I would either lurk or visit his streams. It was just really calming to listen to. It's actually one of the biggest inspirations as to why I started sort of dabbling in ASMR as well. So yeah, feel free to just lurk and sit on by. This is a very cozy book, thankfully. Oh, you're a flatter. No, but genuinely, thank you for the raid. To those who joined in as well, hopefully you can find a nice little cozy. I do need to make the wife breakfast. Have a good stream. Thank you, thank you. I hope you and Fig enjoy your breakfast. It's actually about 10 p.m. here where I'm staying, so for those who are just waking up, hopefully this nice cozy little story about coffee is a good way to start your day. And for those who are just about to settle in, hopefully this will be a nice story to fall asleep to. Alright then, now where were we? Yeah, now I remember. It is. Laney nodded at the library. "Seems you've been mighty busy, miss." She grinned slyly when she said it. "Yeah, I suppose so." "Sleeping in there, are you? Hope you're locking up at night, dear." "It's close to the high street, but I wouldn't like to see you running afoul of somewhat unsavory after dark." Liv couldn't mask her surprise. As a rule, folks spared little thought for her physical well-being, herself included. She was touched. "Don't worry. Locked up tight. But speaking of anyone unsavory," Liv tried to sort out what she wanted to ask. "Had a visitor today. Big hat. She held her hands out wide from her head. Fancy shirt. Stone Fay, I think. You know him?" Laney snorted and slurped her tea. She said nothing for a long moment, then sighed. "One of the madrigals, I reckon." "The madrigal, Some kind of local kingpin?" "A bunch of strain dogs," spat Laney. The madrigal's got the leash, her wrinkles bunched tight around her mouth, but the madrigal ain't to be ignored. When they ask you to pay, she gazed sharply at Viv, and they will ask, you'd best bank your coals and pay. I'm not sure I can bring myself to do that, she replied mildly. Lainey patted Viv's considerable forearm. I know you mayn't have thought to till now, but seems to me you ain't here to do what you've always done. Am I wrong? The old woman had startled her again. Well, that's true, Viv said. Still, for all that, I'm not sure I can roll over for a little man in a big hat and a silly shirt. Lainey chuckled darkly. Never mind the man in the hat. The madrigal's what you want to worry about. Nothing silly about them. I'll be careful, said Viv. They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes. Viv glanced sidelong at Lainey's mug of tea. Say, you ever have coffee? She asked. Lainey blinked at her and looked affronted. Why, I never have. And when I was brought up, a lady doesn't talk about her maladies, she said primly. Viv barked a laugh, to the old woman's great annoyance. Viv moved her bedroll and lantern to the loft under the slope of the roof. The smell of coffee beans filtered up through the cracks in the boards, and she inhaled it deeply, like a warm, earthy memory. The tarpaulin thumped like a distant drum in the occasional gust of wind. In the lantern's light, black blood gleamed where it leaned against the wall. Viv stared at it for a long time and thought about the man in the hat in the madrigal. She felt a sudden impulse to sleep next to the blade, as she had in 100 campsites and bivouacs? Bivouacs. Not sure about this word. She deliberately turned away, extinguished the lantern, and filled her lungs with a dark smell from below. On the roof there was a solid thud, followed by a rhythmic heavy padding and a scratching clatter on the tiles. But she was already beginning to doze, and she lost it in the sound of the tarpaulin. Then she was asleep. Chapter 4. The lumber, tiles, and other supplies came in piecemeal over the next few days. Showers came and went, and then the sky cleared entirely. When it did, Viv and Cal repaired the hole in the roof, shucking old tiles through the gap to shatter on the floor. She was surprised at how many of the timbers they had to take up to mend it fully. Cal was just as methodical and mindful about the repair work as she'd hoped. It was a hard 2 days of labor for the both of them, but the roof was fully proof against water again. Next, Cal examined the interior, sounding the boards with a knuckle and several times digging a fistful of dry, rotten wood out and shaking his head at it. After 4 days of prying out old timber and nailing in fresh, Viv started to wonder if they might have been better off rebuilding the whole damn thing. She rented a cart from the miller again to haul away the debris. They built a permanent and sturdier ladder into the loft. Viv was a fast study and a reasonable hand with a hammer and nails. Accurately slinging a slab of metal and striking a target was squarely within the realm of her abilities. When Cal first clambered into the loft and spied black blood glimmering darkly in the corner, he made no comment on it. "Cozy," he said. "Be wanting a bed and a dresser, no doubt." "No need," said Viv. "I'm used to sleeping rough." "Used to? ain't the same as ought to. But he pressed no further, and that was that. In the main stable area, they did as Cal had suggested, cutting down the stall walls and converting each into a sort of booth. The hob boxed in neat yew benches along the interiors. They pre-assembled tabletops and Viv easily orc-handled them into place across trestles. Viv cut two high windows into the northern and eastern walls, letting the morning sun crawl down from the loft and into the new dining area. We sanded the office counter and added a hinged extension to the end for extra workspace. Cal repurposed some old tack shelves and moved them from the back wall of what Viv now thought of as the storefront. He also managed to replace some cracked panes in the mullioned front window next to the smaller door. Well, it doesn't look much like a stable anymore, observed Viv, watching him fit the last bit of glass. Mighty pleased it quit smelling like one too. One afternoon, Viv returned from the cooper with a water barrel on one shoulder and a few buckets in hand. She tucked the barrel in the corner back of the counter. She drew water from the well a few blocks down, and Cal checked for leaks as she filled it. They converted the back room of the office into a pantry with more shelves. Viv consulted her notes and excavated a pit that she insulated with clay for cold storage. Cal added a neat hinged door. Viv did the latter work on whitewashing the front, while Cal re-chinked the mortar between the river stones low on the walls. When she strode back inside, arming sweat from her forehead and hauling the whitewash bucket, she found him inspecting the flagstones, checking the sand between. Her eyes went to the resting place of the Scalbert's stone, and she had to keep herself from rushing forward to interrupt. "Anything need doing there?" she asked, trying to sound brisk and natural about it. What if he found the stone? Would he recognize it? And so what if he did? It was fair to say she trusted Cal. And yet... He looked up. Maybe a little more sand. This one's loose. Might should take it up and pack some underneath. He stomped on the flag she'd buried the stone under, and her heart leapt. "I'll take care of it," she said, and her smile felt entirely false. Cal didn't seem to notice. He said, and that was that. Later that evening, after glances up and down the street to reassure herself that the man with the hat wasn't peering in at her, Viv did take up the flagstone. She removed the Scalbert stone and held it in her hand. Warm to the touch, it almost seemed to have a lambent yellow glow, independent of the light of the lantern. Replacing it with care, she scooped fistfuls of dirt to re-level the flagstone and smoothed the sand into the crevices again. That night she dreamed of the Scalbert Queen, but when she drove her hand into its skull to remove the stone, its flesh drew tight around her wrist. As she tried to withdraw her fist, she couldn't, and the flesh firmed, and the Scalbert's many eyes ignited one by one like signal fires in the dark. Her efforts to free herself grew increasingly frantic until she startled awake. Nerves in her right arm were alight, her hand tingling with pins and needles. After lying awake for some time, she finally slept again, and by morning she'd forgotten the dream. Days passed in a haze of hot work, aching, aching muscles, slivers, dust, and the smells of sweat and lime and fresh cut wood. No worries, hey. I was able to do the shout out, and yeah, we were rated by Best Dad Trooper. A very good ASMR artist for those of you who came with the raid. At the end of 2 weeks, the place looked downright respectable. Viv found herself out in the street a few times a day, hands on her hips, surveying the shop with a rising warm sense of accomplishment. On one of these occasions, she was startled to find Lainey suddenly beside her. The woman used her broom as a walking stick, leaning her weight on it. Viv had no idea how she'd arrived so silently. Well, fanciest library I've ever seen, Lainey said, then nodded and went back to her porch. Unsure why she hadn't done it sooner, Viv set up the ladder and tore down the old Parkins library sign, tossing it into the rubbish pile with real satisfaction. Going to need a new sign, said Cal, his thumbs hooked into the waist of his breeches, staring up at the vacant iron bracket. You know, said Viv, I took a lot of notes, figured I'd covered most details, but I never really thought about a sign or a name. She looked down at Cal. Just never crossed my mind. It was quiet for a minute. Then Cal cleared his throat, and in the most hesitant voice she'd ever heard from him, he ventured, Viv's place? Good as any, I suppose, she replied. I don't have a better idea. He didn't look satisfied. Maybe Viv's coffee? I'll be honest, feels strange having my name on anything. Like putting your own face on the sign. A pause. Could you say coffee, I suppose? Don't expect there'll be a lot of confusion. Viv squinted hard at him and thought he'd outlast her, but then his mouth quirked at the corner. I figure I'll table it for now, she said. Who knows? Maybe I'll name it after you. Calamity Coffee has a nice sound to it. Cal regarded her, sniffed, and then said solemnly, Well, you're not wrong. Later that week, the bulk of the construction was complete. They built a big trestle table and benches ran between the booths. She and Cal stained and oiled them all, swept the floors clean, and set glass in the new high windows. Viv hoisted a chandelier and secured it to a bolt plate Cal set into the wall. As evening drew on, they lit it with a long taper, both pleased with the glow it cast, the ringed shadow pulsing below. At the table, with Viv notes between them, they discussed some of the finer points of furnishings and rugs, and maybe some reeds to freshen the smell of the place. They both halted their conversation at once. In the doorway stood the man in the hat, with company to boot. They were less well dressed, a motley assortment of men, 2 humans in a dwarf with a cropped beard and clubbed back hair. Viv saw at least 2 short swords, and would have wagered there were at least 6 knives between them, in one cuff or another. Wondered when you'd stop back by, said Viv. She didn't bother to rise. I'm flattered to have occupied your thoughts, said the man, stepping across the threshold and surveying the renovations with an appreciative nod. You've been mightily industrious. The old place never looked better. Seems you won't be in the business of horseflesh, though. Viv shrugged. A smile from the last visit might never have lapsed in all the intervening days. Look, I enjoy a witty back and forth as much as the next man, but I sense you appreciate directness. I'm merely a representative. My friends call me Lack. You can, too. This street, this entire southern quarter, is under the watchful and beneficent eye of the madrigal. He sketched a bow, as though the madrigal himself were here to see it. We appreciate all of you in the chat that joined the raid. Yes, yes we do. You think I need a watchful eye? Viv's brows rose. We all need someone to watch out for us, replied Lack. This is the part where you let me know about the monthly involuntary donation for, what did you call it? A beneficent eye? Lack cocked a finger at her and his smile widened. Well, you've said your piece. Viv casually dismissed him by returning to the study of her notes. Cal hadn't budged an inch during the entire exchange, his face rigid. Lack's voice developed an annoyed edge. I'll expect your contribution end of the month. 1 sovereign, 2 silvers is the going rate. What you expect is your business. Viv's reply was mild. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the heavies behind Lack make a move to approach, which would have been a laughable mistake, but he stopped them with a gesture. There was a heavy silence while Viv waited for a rebuttal. Then Lack and his crew were gone. Cal let out a long breath. And shot her a worried glance. Listen, you don't want to run afoul of the madrigal, he said in a soft voice. When the hob normally spoke, it was always even and solid, like he was laying brick. The change in him made her look at him seriously. That's what Lainey said. She put one of her hands on the table and opened it wide. But Cal, I think you have a pretty good idea of what these hands have done. Do you really see me bobbing with the courtesy to a bunch of men too stupid to know the odds if they were to tangle with me? I don't doubt you'd lay those 4 low, no problem. But listen, there's a lot more than 4 of them out there, and the madrigal is the sort to make an example. I've heard a lot of stories and a lot of legends in my time, and they're always worse than the real thing. I can take care of myself here. Maybe so. This place, though? He rapped the table with a knuckle. It ain't fireproof. So fine, you can take care of yourself. But I figure there's more you got a stake in. Am I wrong? Sorry, I just had to take a sip of coffee there. Viv frowned and stared at him, lost for words. Cal got up, leveled a finger at her, and said, Wait. He rummaged in some of the last remaining supplies and retrieved hammer and nails. Upon his toes, at the wall behind the counter, he banged some brackets into the wood. 1, 2, 3. At least do this. Put that sword of yours up there, he said. If you're gonna show him you got teeth, at least fix it so you can bite when you need to. When Viv retired for the night, black blood rested on those brackets, a killing slab. She wished it was still hidden in the corner. Viv hadn't expected Cal, but around noon he showed up, riding in the back of a cart next to a big black stove and several lengths of stovepipe rather. She gave him the side eye as he leapt down. What's all this? He shrugged. I said you needed a kitchen, and before you say anything, it's already paid for. She tossed up her hands, both amused and exasperated. The horses shied nervously. Where'd you get this? I'm not a baker. He gestured at the upper room. It's cold here in winter, and no fireplace to speak of. You want to freeze up there in the loft, laying on the floor, snow on the roof? Give me a hand with this. Viv held her peace as she hefted the stove out of the bed of the wagon, one end at a time. Even for her, the heavy iron thing was difficult to maneuver. She eventually got it down and walked it end by end into the storefront by way of the big doors. Cal carried the stovepipe piece by piece and then paid the impatient driver. She was surprised to find that she was a little winded. Her back was gnawing at her again, too, as she fell onto one of the benches. Can't let you pay for it, Cal. Too bad. Already paid me too much. Figured if I was gonna waste it on something foolish, this might as well be it. Eat for winter, huh? Cal nodded. And if the bean water doesn't work out, Viv laughed. Speaking of that, she gestured at the counter, where a mortar and pestle sat next to a few kettles, a tumble of cloth, and some fired clay cups. Taken up apothecary, too. Hang on, just let me grab another sip of my coffee. I'll show you. But let's get this thing out of the middle of the floor first. At some direction from Cal, she positioned the stove against the west wall, and after some figuring and fussing and cursing, he got the stovepipe affixed. With a little cutting by brace drill and saw, and some arc comments from Viv, he fed the pipe through the flange where it met the wall. A few hours later, they had the end run up past the eaves and topped with a rain cap. They made do with some scrap for kindling and started a small blaze in the side box. The smoke drew up and out just fine. "All right," said Viv. "Get some water in one of those kettles and put it on." Cal raised his eyebrows. "Bean water. You want to test the stove or not?" He shrugged and went about it, filling the kettle from the water barrel. Viv dug out a handful of coffee beans from one of the sacks, crushed them in the mortar, and poured the grounds into a tube of linen. She stretched the tube, over the mouth of one of the clay cups, and when the kettle whistled, she slowly poured boiling water through, a little at a time. "Is that a lady's stocking?" asked Cal. Viv glanced at him. "It's clean. I don't wear stockings. Just asking," he said mildly. She said. It seemed he was rubbing off on her. "How exactly were you planning to use that kettle with no stove?" he asked pointedly. "Needed it to fill the machine that's coming. Just a happy accident." Viv completed a last spiraling pour and waited for the swollen grounds to steep. Removing the linen sleeve and swirling the cup, she closed her eyes, brought it to her nose, and inhaled deeply. She took an experimental taste and smiled, nodding. "That's not half bad." Cal frowned at her. Now, she said defensively, this isn't as good as it'll be when I can make it right. But she handed him the cup. He made a big show of sniffing at it. He raised his eyebrows and nodded a little. Very slowly and very delicately, he sipped at it. Then he held it in his hand and stood there. After what Viv considered an overly generous few moments, she couldn't help herself. Well, said Cal. I'll allow. It's actually not that terrible. Later, they sat at the big table, each with their own cup. Cal pretended to ignore his, but Viv caught him stealing cautious sips now and then when he thought she wasn't looking. She held her own in both hands, contemplatively, absorbing the heat and the scent. It felt like completing a loop, like the satisfying click of a clasp snapping closed. So, she said, you can also make these with milk. You might like it. Milk? Cal made a face. Better than it sounds. You'll have to try it once I have the machine. The gnomes called it a latte. Latte? That means something? Named after the gnomish barista who invented them, I think. Latte diameter. Cal gave her a long-suffering look. Can't explain what one word means with another word nobody knows. What's a barista? Cal, I didn't invent the words. Folks are gonna need a new education just to buy some some coffee. I don't know. I kind of like it. It's more exotic that way. Lady stockings and exotic bean water. Gods help us. Alright. We are now on chapter 5, chat. We'll see how far we get with this chapter, and then let's see where we take it from there. The jobs board sat at the east end of the largest square in Thune. It was long and low, and beneath newer scraps of parchment or fool's cap, furred with the ragged flakes of 100 others. As Viv scanned the notices, she endured a weary onrush of memory. Beast hunts, bounties, and battles. She might have torn down 5 score of those sheets herself in one city or another, knuckles bloodied to claim her due for a job done. She'd even posted a few in her time. A hireling here, filling out a hunting party there. This one was nothing like the others. She spiked her notice on one of the many iron studs and read over what she'd written. Assistant wanted, must be willing to learn. Management and food service experience desired. Advancement opportunities. Patience a plus. Wages commensurate. Inquire at the old library on Redstone. Afternoon to dusk. Oh, that really reminds me of job applications. It was a long shot, but the Scalbert Stone hadn't let her down yet. She returned to the shop, but found herself restless and pacing. She'd sent post for her most important delivery on her first day in the city. And while the coffee had shown up promptly, the other parcel had yet to arrive. With the shop repaired and cleaned and nothing upon which to expend her nervous energy, she felt thwarted. After weeks of steady work and with Cal absent, her hands itched with the inactivity. At last, in exasperation, she gathered her notes into her satchel and hiked to the pub she'd visited on her first night in Thune. She sat at a table in the back, ordered a meal, and made increasingly irrelevant lists. When noon arrived, her meal remained half eaten, and her nervous organizational efforts were in shambles. So she lunged from her seat, paid, and stalked back to the shop to wait. The idea that an applicant would arrive on the first day was, of course, ludicrous. But the Scalbert stone, well, she either trusted its power or she didn't. And if she did, the Scalbert stone of fire draws the ring of fortune. Viv started a fire, boiled water, ground some beans, and made a cup of coffee, which she drank too quickly. Then she made another, and another. As a result, she was nervier than ever and wished she'd written other instructions on the advertisement, or that her probably misplaced faith in the power of the stone wasn't keeping her corralled there. Did she really believe it would deliver results so soon? Black blood hung ominously on the wall, and she found herself wanting to take it down to sharpen it, and to lose herself in the repetitive familiar action of it, but she forced her gaze away. She found herself annoyed that Cal had made her hang it up, and then angry at herself for blaming him, since that was a stupid thing to think. Viv could have juggled the man one-handed. He hardly made her do anything. And then, in the late mid-afternoon, there was a rap on the door, and it opened briskly. A woman strode in, glancing about in a way that was both cautious and confident. She was tall, not as tall as Viv, of course, with glossy black hair cut severely at chin length. She wore breeches and what looked like a sweater, dark and shapeless, with a collar that covered her throat. Her face was aristocratic, her eyes dark. Viv also noted with surprise the short stubs of horn parting her hair, the hint of a dusty magenta in her skin, and her whipcord tail. The woman was clearly a succubus. Viv's head was already buzzing from her fourth cup of coffee, and she started up from her seat. The woman slowly looked her up and down, but her expression didn't change. She glanced deliberately at black blood on the wall, and then back, rather. "Assistant wanted," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was throaty, but she spoke precisely. That's right," replied Viv, and just stood there. The woman's eyebrows slowly rose, and she closed the door behind her. She held out a hand. "Tandri," she said. "Viv." She awkwardly returned the handshake, cursing herself for drinking so much coffee. "I'm sorry, I didn't expect anyone to actually show up on the first day," she said, which was absolutely untrue, but seemed a good excuse for how scattered she probably appeared. "I like to be prompt," said Tandri. Good. Viv tried to get a hold of herself. She'd hired help before. Sure, they'd been mercenaries and cut purses, but the principle was the same. Lay out the job, set forth the terms, get a feeling for whether they'd cut and run at an inconvenient moment, and then make the call. Easy. "So, I'm looking for an assistant. I guess that's clear from the notice. The job's sort of, you ever hear of coffee?" The succubus shook her head, hair moving like a liquid curtain. "I have not." "Well, that's fine. Doesn't matter. Tea, though. You know tea. I'm opening the shop soon. Kind of like a tea shop, but coffee. and can't run it all by myself. I need somebody willing to learn the work, take customers, help with whatever needs doing. Probably some cleaning too, and they'd make coffee, as needed. After some instruction from me, I wrote a food service experience in a notice. You have that? Tandri's expression didn't falter in the slightest. I do not. Um, the succubus inclined her head at Viv. Do you? Viv's mouth hung open for a moment until she eventually managed. I do not. I am willing to learn. I was higher up on the notice, said the woman. That's true. Viv scratched the back of her head. Gods, this was so awkward. Advancement opportunities is also said, prompted Tandri. What sorts of opportunities? I did write that, didn't I? Well, I mean, if things went well, I guess it would depend on what your interests were. There was a very awkward pause. Viv wrestled with what she was about to say. She'd never been skilled at putting things delicately. It had never been a particularly important up till now. Succubi had a reputation for certain biological imperatives. Were their needs and predilections even a choice? She forged onward. You're a succubus, right? At the applied addendum to that question, Tandri's expression changed for the first time. A pinching of the lips, a tightening around the eyes. Her tail lashed behind her. I am, and you're an orc, running a not tea shop. No judgment from me, Viv babbled, feeling on the precipice of a great mistake, but stumbling forward nonetheless. I only ask because, no, I have no desire to vamp your customers if that's your question. Tandri's voice was icy. That wasn't what I was planning to say, said Viv. I would never assume that. I've just never worked with one of you, and I wasn't sure about your needs. Gods, this was agonizing. Her cheeks were aflame. Tandri closed her eyes and crossed her arms in front of her. Her cheeks were flushed as well. Viv was absolutely sure she was about to turn heel and leave. She sighed. I apologize. Look, I am very bad at this. I don't really know what I'm doing. She hooked a thumb at the great sword on the wall. This is what I know. What I've always known. I just want to know something else now. To be something else. Everything I said was stupid. I, of all people, ought to know better than to assume anything based on what you were born as. Before I walk out, do you mind if I start over? Tandri took a slow breath in through her nose, out through her mouth. There's no need to start over. Ah, said Viv, disappointed. I understand. Why waste the time? We've covered most of the particulars, continued the succubus briskly. So, wages commensurate? Viv goggled at her for a moment, then stammered. 3 silver, 8 bits a week to start. 4 silver. I, uh, yes, that's fine. Acceptable. Then you want the job? I do. Tandri held out her hand again. Viv shook it in a daze. Well then, welcome aboard. Thanks. She'd set out to hire an assistant, but she had the overwhelming sense that she'd just acquired a partner without meaning to. She couldn't help wondering who had interviewed whom. "It's settled then," said Tandri. "A pleasure to meet you, Viv." Then she turned and left, closing the door gently behind her. "Patience a plus," Viv murmured. It was several minutes before she noticed that she hadn't even specified when the work would start, but somehow she wasn't worried about it. Viv went directly to the square and tore down her notice, which hadn't hung for more than 7 hours. She folded it and tucked it into a pocket, then returned to the shop, where she wiped away the debris of her furtive bean grinding. Afterward, Viv went out and ate a hearty meal, coming home pleasantly, warm and full. As she sat toying with the witch rod in the dining area, her gaze returned again and again to the place where Scalbert's stone rested. Later, staring at the ceiling from her bedroll, she thought about her impending delivery and the feeling of potential motion building in her. All that remained was for that last obstruction to be kicked away. She heard a thud on the roof tiles. Heavy footfalls clattered noisily as something large tracked to the western wall. There was a pregnant pause, and then a thump. Viv quietly stole from her bedroll, descended the ladder, and paced the dark, quiet street, trying to see onto the roof before checking the alley to the west. But she found nothing. Okay. We've hit chapter 6, and I think this will be a nice place to sort of put a bookmark on Legends and Lattes. But yeah, the night is still a bit young for me. I think I might. Let's see, I should have a nice cozy game of sorts to keep up with the mood of the story. Let's see, I guess we can play for just a bit. But yeah, once again, thanks to Best Dad Tuber for the raid. Thanks to everyone who also decided to stick in with the raid as well. I typically do a couple of streams, typically Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, sometimes on Sundays as well. Typically I do your typical games like Genshin, sometimes Warframe. I also do quite a lot of visual novel games. Sometimes horror, sometimes a bit cozier. But I also do every now and then, as you're all seeing today or tonight, ASMR. I do try to get I do try to help people try to relax as the night rolls on or as their day starts, reading, hopefully, cozy and comfy stories. So while I still have all your attention, I guess we can cap today off with... Actually, you know what? I think I'll read just a little bit more of chapter 6 before we call it a night. Okay. Chapter 6. Viv's lack of concern was vindicated. In Tandri did indeed turn up the following morning. Viv was wringing out her wet hair into the street, a half-full bucket by her side. She'd reverted to camp bathing after discovering she disliked visiting the nearest bathhouse. She coiled up her hair and pinned it, then stood, palming water off of her face. I should have said when we'd start, she said. Can't open yet. Still waiting on a delivery. Well, it seemed there was plenty to do already, Tandri observed. She was just as severe and direct as the previous day, with none of the sensual sway that Viv had noticed in other succubi she met, although admittedly that was a vanishingly small number. Only the syrupy gloss of Tandri's hair and the sinuous lash of her tail hinted at anything but crisp efficiency. Well, asked Viv, I'll need to know what I'll be doing. No time like the present. Right. Well, I can't really show you the particulars until the equipment gets here, but the plan for today was to sort out some dishware and furnishings. I'm not much of a decorator, but I've got a few ideas. I was going to find a potter and see about tables for the street, some chairs, maybe, she waved vaguely, some paintings? I thought this would be the easy part, but it's very fiddly. If I can make a suggestion, said Tandri. Didn't sound like a question. Viv made a be my guest gesture. Thune Market is today and tomorrow, the same as every week. If you want to be thrifty about it and save a lot of needless wandering, that's what I'd recommend. Willing to tour me around? It's your silver, said Tandri. And while her tone was as even as ever, Viv thought she caught the ghost of a smile. In Viv's experience, most of the non-martial folk she met stepped carefully in her presence, as though cringing from a blow that would never come. She enjoyed the succubus's frank disposition. Cal had an entirely different species of that bluntness. She wondered again about the Scalbert stone and what it promised to draw to her. Viv locked up and followed Tandri north of the high street to a long curving thoroughfare where many of the tradesfolk clearly had permanent storefronts or workshops. She was surprised to note that it was near where she'd visited the locksmith when she'd first arrived. Okay. There we go. Most vendors had awnings, tables, and displays set up on the wide street, and there was already a thickening mass of shoppers. They browsed for a few hours past noon. Viv kept her eyes out for the items on her list, and Tandri deftly steered her away from some bad buys, noting subtle cracks in pottery or poor joins in ironwork. Without prompting or permission, she took over the process of negotiation, and Viv could see that, despite how thoroughly she cloaked herself in neutral clothing and poise, and Tandri didn't trade on physical allure at all, the merchants responded to something. In the end, Viv paid for a full set of clay plates, mugs, and cups, and a pair of much larger copper kettles. She also secured a hefty box of pewter spoons and cutlery, a utensil hanger, a rug, two wrought iron tables with chairs to match, 5 wall lanterns, assorted cleaning supplies, and a scattering of pastoral paintings that Viv thought looked blurry, but Tandri maintained they were evocative. In most cases, the succubus secured delivery as part of the deal, although Viv carried the box of cutlery and the utensil hanger under one arm as they left. After dropping them off at the shop, Viv insisted on thanking Tandri with a late lunch. It was a Fey-run cafe on the high street that was only open during the day, and somehow it seemed appropriate to the moment. The day was warm and the smell of the river was strong. We sat at one of the tables on the street. Fey cuisine was known for its buttery breads and artful presentation, and while Viv wasn't normally particular about what she ate, she had to admit that she'd acquired a taste for it. "So," she said, as they waited on their meal, "have you always lived here in Thune?" "No," replied Tandri, poised in her seat. "I've lived lots of places." The succubus then smoothly redirected. "And you're clearly not the cosmopolitan sort." "Why Thune?" Liv's thought about the ley lines, the real reason she'd chosen Thune, and figured that was a thorny to explain. She settled on a truthful but less complicated response. "Research," she said. Viv glanced ruefully down at herself. "You wouldn't know it to look at me, but I do a lot of reading. Anyway, once I got it into my head to do this, I spent a lot of time in Atheniums, talked to a lot of people, and this seemed the best place for plenty of reasons." "Coffee," Tandri said, quirking a small smile. "Not tea. Long-held dream or just a change of pace?" Viv explained her encounter with it in Azimuth a little more eloquently than she'd managed with Cal. Tandri looked thoughtful. "Seems a far cry from what you might have done before." "And what line of work do you assume I was in?" Viv arched a brow. Tandri looked stricken. "You're right, that was stupid, especially..." Viv snorted. "I'm just baiting you. My hide's thicker than that. And for what it's worth, your assumption isn't wrong. You don't get this many scars farming." Tandri gave her a searching look and then appeared to relax. Her food arrived, and once the Fey server left, Tandri lifted her mug of weak beer. Well, to misplaced assumptions. As they ate, Viv continued. "I think I'd been looking for a way out for years. Adventuring, fighting, hunting bounties. You're either bleeding yourself slow from 100 wounds or waiting on one death blow. But you get numb to the possibility of anything different. This was the first time something else made me feel a way I wanted to keep feeling. So here I am, and with some blood still in me." Tandri nodded, but said nothing. Viv waited, thinking Tandri might have something to say on her own behalf, but she quietly ate instead. Maybe another time. Still, it was a very pleasant meal. Alright, and I think we can end it there. So, once again, to all the raiders who hopped in with Dad's raid, welcome to the Chip Cup Cafe. I'm your host and your barista, Moka Kahvesi. You can just call me Moka, and I do hope you enjoyed your stay here. I'll admit this was a bit of a pleasant surprise to start my week with, and hopefully this was a pleasant way for some of you to start your day with as well. For now, let's try looking to pass on this raid to someone else who might need it. I'll try finding someone cozy as well. As much as I'd like to continue on the ASMR train, it is a bit tricky finding universally palatable content, for lack of a better word. So give me a few minutes, I'll try finding someone to raid. Okay, I think we found someone to raid and send over. Let me just set that up here. Okay. So, once again, chat, thank you for coming into the Chip Cup Cafe, and we do hope to see you again next time. We do have a stream this Thursday for Coffee Talk for those who are interested. It's a nice little cozy sort of visual novel if you've played games like Valhalla and such. So, sort of following the train of baristas and cafes. I have played through it before, and I do a little bit of voice acting, or at least I try to. So if that's something you're interested, you're free to hop on by. It'll be at around 8 p.m. PHT. I'm not sure how to convert that just yet into GMT and such, so I'll probably put that out later on. But yeah, once again, I hope you all enjoyed your stay, and may you have a wonderful day, afternoon, or evening. Goodbye now.